And so I was like, okay, this is the skill set I have. I know that I can write this thing down. I know I can get the word out. I know I have all these incredible colleagues that will help. It doesn't help you to stay quiet. It doesn't help you to cower. You should be a model to your students and to the people in your community of ways to resist this. There are already internal bodies in universities. Specifically, I'm thinking of faculty senates that I hope will really begin to band together and really speak out. If you are not actively resisting, then we're not in this together because you're not putting yourself at risk in the same way that all of us are.
It was also a decision of how can I make my little resignation at the state university the biggest impact possible. Sometimes you have to get messy and you don't know, you can't predict everything that's going to happen from it. But sometimes you just have to, throw yourself on the gears of the machine. Taking action changes you. You're not the same person you were the day before. Your fear becomes less. You become kind of excited by the fact of your own agency.
Welcome to episode 246 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism works to unite all who can be united, to join in mass nonviolent protest and resistance in the streets and throughout society, growing to include millions and refusing to stop until we create such a profound political crisis that Trump cannot impose his fascist program or even maintain his hold on power. Big thanks to our patrons, everyone who rates, reviews, shares the show, and reps our merch. Every bit helps connect more people with the movement demanding Trump must go now. If you haven't yet, take a second to leave a review, share the show, or hit up our merch store. We now have Trumpler posters available for you to get in sets of 2 or sets of 10 with our humanities slogan and our Trump must go now demand. So be sure to check out the store. Today, we're featuring 2 interviews with academics who've used their platforms to say silence in the face of fascism is collaboration with fascism. First, you'll hear from Emily Van Dyne, an associate professor at Stockton University who co-authored and signed an open letter titled Silence is Collaboration, Academics Must Speak Out Against Fascism. Then you'll hear from Heather Squire, who earlier this month gave up her doctoral fellowship at the University of Buffalo Department of Environment and Sustainability to protest the university's silence amid national arrests and planned deportations of international students in recent weeks. But first, a couple escalations of fascism that we need to mention that emphasize the now in our demand. Trump must go now. Trump issued a memorandum this week instructing the Department of Justice to ramp up their investigation of Act Blue, the primary fundraising platform of the Democratic Party. Act Blue processes money for Democratic election campaigns for Democratic Party causes and through Act Blue charities, even for 501c3 organizations, nonprofit arms of the Democratic Party, not election-related entities. The claims revolve around supposed illegal foreign donations to the Democratic Party processed through Act Blue. The Trump fascist regime is seeking to entirely eliminate donations to their opposition party. Let's be clear. These unsubstantiated claims are coming from fascists who have systematically legalized the most egregious campaign corruption, who crafted the Citizens United decision and pioneered the super PAC dark money strategy, who sued to allow quote-unquote campaign contributions to continue after elections are over and decided, essentially becoming bribes to elected officials. These fascists are aggressively expanding gerrymandering, decimating the Voting Rights Act, and most essentially, refusing to accept the results of any election they do not win. These fascists represent an empire that has proudly controlled and corrupted elections in countries spanning the globe for decades. While the White House claims that the goal of these investigations is to protect the integrity of American elections, it's clear their goal is to turn the electoral process alongside law enforcement, the judiciary, educational institutions, law firms, social media monopolies, and every institution of American life into a bludgeon for fascist rule. As one guest of the show, David Smith of The Guardian, recently made clear, almost every form of government on Earth has had elections. Germany had elections in 1938. Italy had elections in 1934. In cutting the funding to the only viable electoral opposition in the country, with the second most expensive election campaigns in the world after India under the rule of fascist Narendra Modi, the fascists' aim is clear: to cement their rule in perpetuity. Another key escalation this week was the FBI arresting Milwaukee Circuit Court Judge Hannah Dugan. She was taken into custody for allegedly allowing an immigrant in her court to use a different door to avoid ICE agents sent to arrest him. This case highlights the reality of Trump's cruel policy, enabling ICE to arrest people in sensitive areas, hospitals, schools, religious institutions, and courthouses, and is yet one more direct attack on the judiciary. Thus far, the regime has defied a quickly growing list of court orders, even the unanimous order from the Supreme Court to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia from the Salvadorian death camp CICAD. They have used the power of the state to attack law firms for representing clients opposing the regime and Trump personally. They have stacked federal courts with fascist ideologues, including ramming through Amy Coney Barrett's ascension to the Supreme Court in the last days of Trump 1. This arrest for enabling the evasion of ICE agents is a threat to every member of the judiciary and every person in this country. It is not a district judge's job to enforce federal immigration policy. We are in new and dangerous territory when judges are no longer bound to the rule of law, but the rule of Trump. Through this arrest, Trump is making clear that every citizen of this country has essentially been deputized to help ICE or be arrested. Now, to the topic of this week's interviews. J.D. Vance has frequently and infamously, proudly waxed poetic, saying, quote, "There is a wisdom in what Richard Nixon said approximately 40 to 50 years ago. He said, and I quote, 'The professors are the enemy,' end quote." The Trump fascist regime has been waging an all-out assault against universities across the country by cutting government funding for research and at the same time attempting to take control of the university's key internal workings. What gets taught? Who gets taught? Who gets to teach it? Earlier this week, Trump signs an executive order seeking to repeal core tenet of the Civil Rights Act. As put by Fatima Goss-Graves, president of the National Women's Law Center, this order, quote, instructs the government to stop enforcing key civil rights protections in the workplace, at schools, and throughout society. A president does not have the power to take away core civil rights protections with a flick of his wrist, end quote. He also signs an executive order targeting college accreditors, who he said in 2023 are, quote, radical left accreditors that have allowed our colleges to become dominated by Marxist maniacs and lunatics, end quote. It is part of the Trump fascist regime's crusade on any study that challenges or even questions white supremacy, male supremacy, Christian supremacy, and American hegemony. Using the accreditation process to target institutions that the Trump regime deems low quality, woke, could lead to major financial fallouts for institutions that rely heavily on federal financial aid. I gotta say, universities have always had this special role of not just teaching facts, but at their best, being spaces where critical thinking, dissent, envisioning better worlds, and the search for the truth could really thrive, sometimes even more than in the broader society. And that's exactly what the Trump regime is trying to shut down. Their goal is to turn universities into places of indoctrination and obedience, where Trump and the MAGA fascists get to decide what's true, what's false, what can be taught, and what can't, and who gets to teach it. Harvard has become a flashpoint in the struggle over the future of the universities because they simply, quote, will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights, end quote. While many have pointed out that they were able to do so because of their large endowment, it was that stature, too, that made them a target for Trump's ire. Harvard's rejection of Trump's demands are sparking real courage, and it's helping to fuel a broader resistance. From expressions of solidarity from a few university presidents at other prestigious universities, such as Stanford, Princeton, Wesleyan, to a growing movement among Big Ten faculty forming alliance to respond to any quote-unquote legal, financial, and political attacks from Trump on higher ed, to the nearly 1,000 faculty members at Yale who signed a letter calling on their leaders to resist Trump's demands. and to the over 150 university presidents that have signed a joint letter denouncing, quote, unprecedented government overreach and political interference, end quote. The battle between the Trump MAGA fascist regime and places like Harvard and, to be real, universities across the country is going to be fierce. And it's extremely important that all people of conscience are paying attention to it, and not just paying attention to it, but supporting the fight, the political fight against Trump and MAGA fascism. This is a fight that needs to involve everyone on campus: students, professors, administrators, staff, anyone who refuses to be part of a fascist institution. And it can't just stay on campuses. It's got to be supported and taken up by the broader community too. Yes, alumni. Yes, people in the area right near the university, but really all of society. This can't be final exam season, commencement season as normal. The remaining 3 weeks that most campuses are open need to be a time where these campuses transform into hubs of anti-fascist resistance, places where the demand "Trump must go now" is seen, heard, and acted on, with thousands and thousands of professors and students reading, signing, spreading a call to conscience, a call to act from refusefascism.org, and many students dedicating their summer to refuse fascism. With that, you will now hear from academics using their voice to inspire resistance. First up, Professor Emily Van Dyne. Today, we're speaking with Emily Van Dyne, Associate Professor of Writing at Stockton University. She's the author of Loving Sylvia Plath, Reclamation, and one of the signatories of a bold and urgent statement published earlier this month in LitHub titled "Silence is Collaboration. Academics Must Speak Out Against Fascism." Van Dyne and 17 other professors, I believe at Stockton University, signed this statement, naming the stakes clearly: refusing to look away and refusing to be silent. We'll talk about what it means to speak out now, not when it's safe, but when it's necessary. And we'll ask what responsibility those with platforms, especially in academia, have when fascism is no longer at the gates, but in the halls of power. So welcome, Emily. Thanks for joining the show.
Hi, Sam. Thank you for having me.
So first off, tell us a little bit about how this statement came about, and in particular, what motivated you to sign your name onto it.
So it's so funny because I think it was about a month ago, but so much has happened in the last month, both on campus and in the current political landscape, that I'm like, wow, that was only a month ago. Yeah, essentially it was inspired by the kidnapping of Mahmoud Khalil and Rumeza Ozturk. Khalil was kidnapped from Columbia University graduate housing, and Ozturk was taken off the street. I think when I saw the video of Ozturk, that really set something off in me. I also had a real moment watching the video of Khalil be taken and hearing his wife, who was 8 months pregnant at the time and who has now tragically had to give birth without her husband by her side to their first child. I just was devastated by the sound of her voice. She kept calling him my love. "Where are you going, my love? Where are you taking him?" And he was saying, "It's okay, it's okay." It just horrified me. As an academic who has always been outspoken about political issues, both internally and also, nationally when I have a platform, I felt like if you don't see yourself in his position, in any of the positions of the activists who have been imprisoned as a result of their activism, then you really are not being honest with yourself. And if you don't, then are not, I think, inspired to speak out publicly about that, then I don't really know why we have these platforms, right? Like, what is the point? I've been working with a group of like-minded colleagues and friends at Stockton University, where I teach in Southern New Jersey. We got together and decided we had to write something. And thankfully, I have a pretty long-standing relationship with Literary Hub. They've been publishing my work about Plath and also about campus sexual assault since 2017. They have really been on the right side of history, I think, in terms of the work that they've been publishing, particularly about the genocide in Palestine. So I asked if they would publish it, and they did. And I was really, really glad. And I was one of the people that helped to write it. I was grateful that they gave us a platform.
That's so wonderful. Their publication of this and other similarly essential statements of refusal in this moment, and they did in 2020 as well. It stands out because so many platforms are just total shit when it comes to publishing open letters or statements of conscience or anything like that. Definitely kudos to them, and kudos to all of you for such a beautiful letter. When you read it, which everyone listening should, it's in the show notes, you feel both the humanity that's being upheld, the humanity of Mahmoud, the humanity of Ramisa, the humanity of all these students who've been abducted and disappeared. But you also see the humanity of the professors who signed on. And I think that both of those things coming to light and being presented in stark contrast to like this sanitized and silent ivory tower culture, I think is really powerful. I was wondering what you in particular, and if you want to speak on behalf of others, that's welcome too, what you hoped would come out of such a letter, what your goals were with it.
Well, I had seen a letter from New England Scholars Speak. I'm on their mailing list. And so I had received a letter by them, a collective open letter saying we had to build these coalitions. And so I think more than anything, I just wanted the word to be out there that they have comrades and colleagues, like-minded colleagues at Stockton, because we're not an Ivy League. We're not even like an R1. We're actually, I think when my colleagues and I were talking in our chat about like what to call our group, I said like, okay, we're from a mid-sized public university. And my one colleague was like, are we even mid-sized? You know, I mean, we're very small. We are like in the middle of nowhere. It's an unusual school in a lot of ways. We just wanted people to know, like, we're here too. And also because I felt like, okay, at that point, like Harvard had not yet responded in the way that they've recently responded, which I should say, like, I'm glad that they did, but it feels like the barest of bare minimums, but at least they didn't. At least they didn't wholesale cave in the face of these absurd demands in the way that Columbia had. And so I was like, well, all right, there's a lot of universities and colleges in this country. And I would be shocked if Donald Trump or anyone working for him even knows that Stockton is a place. So it was like, we're here. There's a lot of people that I think want to do something and feel like they just kind of don't know what to do. So I felt like I wanted to make a public statement about that. I think we all did, everyone that signed on the letter. And also in terms of like my own ability to contribute at this point, you know, everyone has a skill set. One of my skill sets is that I'm good with rhetoric. I can make a concise argument. I teach writing. I teach rhetoric. I teach feminist theory. I'm well grounded in these kind of leftist movements and the history of them as well. And a lot of the colleagues that worked with me on it too. I worked really closely in particular with Roz Siegel, who is the director of our Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. And you're nodding, so I guess you're aware of his work too.
We're going to do an interview with him next month.
That's wonderful. Yeah, he's incredible. And so I was like, okay, this is the skill set I have. I know that I can like write this thing down. I know I can get the word out. I know that LitHub will publish it. I know I have all these incredible colleagues that will help get this done. Unfortunately, not everyone that I hoped would sign on to it did, which I think is really indicative of the fear that people have right now. Because I know that the people that didn't sign on to it, it was not because it was out of line with their political convictions. But I think there is a genuine fear that people have of putting their name out there in opposition to this at the moment, which I understand, but which I just refuse to give into.
I wasn't planning on going here yet in the conversation, but I feel like it's just a natural part of a conversation. You brought it up, so I want to hear your thoughts on it. Many people, your lens is academia. So many people in academia are afraid. They're afraid of the response from the regime. They're afraid of the response from their administration at the university level. They're afraid of the response from the maggots. They're afraid. How have you been able to overcome that fear?
There are two things that come immediately to mind. The first is that I survived a pretty horrific, a violent marriage a long time ago. I left it permanently in 2011 and have for many years since been in another relationship. And I have been lucky enough to raise my three beautiful children with my husband. I mean, I was actually in physical danger. I actually was experiencing violence on a almost a day-to-day basis by the end. And my infant son at the time was also in danger. I mean, I just picked up and ran away with the baby. And then I was a single mom for about 3 years. And I was an adjunct for the majority of that time. So I was what they used to call like a freeway flyer. So I was teaching at one point 8 classes a semester on 4 different campuses and making like $26,000 a year. My life was precarious in a way that I think a lot of tenured academics haven't been for a long time or maybe never were. I think I just learned that like embodied lesson really early, quite young, that it doesn't help you to stay quiet. It doesn't help you to cower. I mean, of course, you have to be strategic about the things that you say and do, but that was a big part of it for me. I mean, there were many amazing people that came to my aid and helped me, thank God. And of course, I had the privilege of my background and my race and my education and all of those things as well. But really, like at the end of the day, it was the background that I had in women's studies, women and gender studies, and intersectional feminism. I think that it didn't just save me. It just taught me that my life had worth, that I deserved to not be in this misery, that I deserved to carve out the life for myself that I wanted, that I deserved to not just give in and like have whatever terrible, miserable life that people were sort of saying that I deserved. And so I think that was part of it. And then through a combination of grit and a lot of luck and circumstance, I got hired onto the tenure track at Stockton University in 2015. And then I was tenured in 2019. But the year that I was tenured, I also went through a really terrible experience at the university. I was teaching both in the writing program and in the women, gender, and sexuality studies program at that time, and had been for years. I mean, I loved my job and I still do. And I was pretty assured I was going to get tenure. I had plenty of publications and all the good things that I needed to get it. And the summer before the academic year that I went up for tenure, the university was sued by 9 different students. And the students claimed that the university had been negligent in handling their sexual assaults. And I was an outspoken critic of the handling because it was about as bad as it can get. And as a result, there was an ongoing, like pretty much a years-long retaliatory campaign against me that included a bogus Title IX suit, bogus IRB violations. But once they actually found me responsible in the language of Title IX for this bogus charge, then I was able, along with my incredible lawyer, Patricia Barish, to sue the university. It went on for years, but we won in the end. Once you file a lawsuit, then you're able to actually talk about these things. And so I was able to write about it and kind of deal with it publicly, which felt like a big relief to me. And then once I did, of course, I got in touch with all of these other people who had experienced this on some level at the universities that they worked at, primarily a writer named Sarah Vereen, who teaches at Arizona State, who's extraordinary. And Sarah got me in touch with Mara Finkelstein. Mara and I have been talking pretty much since last spring when her whole nightmare at Muhlenberg College started. So I think I had that background. You know, once you go through something like that, it's like, well, you just really know. I mean, people can put like all the Audre Lorde, your silence will not protect you stickers or tote bags that they want. But until you really live that, then you know it. I think that's why I chose to act or try to continue to act in the way that I have been.
Thanks for sharing that history with us. And I think it's helpful to get a fuller sense of where you're coming from and your perspective in this. Look, there's so much that this fascist regime is doing every day, and we're not 100 days in yet. For those who haven't been paying as much attention to the universities, could you just give like a quick summary of what you think are the most important things that people who aren't involved in campus culture, who aren't students themselves or professors, what they might not be fully aware of is happening right now?
First, I'll talk sort of generally about what's happening nationally and particularly on Ivy League campuses and more high profile like Research One institutions like UCLA or Rutgers, for instance. This really began last spring with the Palestinian liberation encampments. There were student encampments that included both undergrad and graduate students kind of all over the country, mostly clustered on the East and West Coast, but also there were ones in the Midwest, University of Chicago, places like that. The response by most of those universities was to accuse those students of anti-Semitism and in some cases violently disrupt the spaces that they were occupying. Like the most high profile example of this was at Columbia, of course. The students had taken over Hamilton Hall, which they renamed Hins Hall in honor of Hin Rajiv, the 6-year-old Palestinian girl who was murdered by the IDF. And then pretty much like riot police stormed in and took the hall back and stopped the encampments. And so the shortest possible version of like how that relates to what's happening now is the Trump regime has been levying these charges, they're absolutely bogus charges of anti-Semitism at schools like Columbia University, Harvard University, Cornell, et cetera, and saying that a lot of the protest leaders, like the student protest leaders, and of course this includes Mahmoud Khalil, he's definitely the most high profile of those, were involved in anti-Semitic acts. They have essentially kidnapped some of those students because most of them were here on J-1 visas. They were foreign students, and put them in ICE detention centers. And they've also threatened to withhold hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funding from a lot of these schools. So that's like a little bit about what's happening on the national level. And then more locally, and this has not quite come to Stockton yet, but it has started to affect other schools in our region, including Rowan University, which is like a slightly bigger university to the north of us. There has been a kind of overarching threat that if universities continue to have programs that fall broadly under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, that they will lose federal funding. Some places have just been caving to this, right? So Rowan University, which is the school that I just referred to, that's close by, it's about an hour and a half away from Stockton. They're in New Jersey as well. They reorganized their entire diversity, equity, and inclusion department, which essentially means they got rid of their diversity, equity, and inclusion department. This means programs like the one that I teach in. At the moment, I'm the chair of the Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies program, or Africana Studies. There's any number of queer studies, again, ethnographic studies, like all of these things that can be seen as being sort of outside the canonical idea of university studies. So that's what's happening. I think that's like the fastest way to say it. And of course, there's many smaller examples of things happening across the country on different campuses, different provosts and presidents, either kind of saying, okay, well, fine, and just rolling over and agreeing to do the things that the regime is threatening to take money away from them if they don't do. But then there have also been really, I think, good examples of smaller schools where presidents and provosts are saying, no, we're not going to do this. We refuse to do this.
And I want to put a pin in that because I definitely want to talk more about that. I am wondering, in just the few months that we've been under this regime, we've seen that these staggering assaults on education, on universities, and on the rights and lives of students at these institutions, openly and overtly oppressive and repressive. You named the most horrific, including, the international students being disappeared, funding cuts, censorship, dismantling of DEI. And I'm wondering what you take away from all this about the regime's view of universities and education and how they see its role in consolidating power.
It's ironic to me because it's very clear, and this has been true for a long time, that the right wing of this country generally, but not only the right wing, right, but we'll start there. They see universities as these bastions of leftist thought and places of indoctrination for students, which is hilarious to me because if you have spent any time on any campus in the United States, and I have taught at 6 different universities in 2 different states, and of course, I went to universities to get my degrees. They're very conservative places. I'm not even speaking about the student body as a whole or the faculty as a whole or like the administration of any place as a whole, because of course there's a spectrum of political leanings for any of those sort of like massive groups of people. But like I can't even get my students most of the time to use semicolons properly. So the idea that I could indoctrinate a student into being a communist or whatever is just ludicrous to me. It's very obvious that this current regime and also lots of conservative leaning people, both in government and media and wherever else, have this very erroneous idea that all universities in the United States are these radically left spaces. That's just not true. It's absurd. At Stockton, where I teach, there's a big spectrum in terms of people's political leaning, but the teaching faculty that have actual true like leftist leaning politics, as in like they vote that way, they identify as socialist or communist, there's like 12 of us that I know out of hundreds of teaching faculty. Even with that being said, that's my personal politics. I think that is the great irony, is that it's obvious that the Trump regime sees these places as these like dangerous breeding grounds for communism, or at least that's what they say. Communism and anti-Semitism and Hamas terrorism and all the different like absolutely outrageous claims that they make all the time. But the reality is that campuses are moderate to conservative places in terms of the ways that they deal with politics. And also that there has long been a crackdown on free speech on college campuses and academic freedom for at least the last like 35 to 40 years, really since they switched to this kind of model of like neoliberal donors in the 1980s. They went from like, at a certain point in the 1980s and 90s, there was this huge shift. I don't want to get into like the long, boring history of like critical university studies in the US, but there was this shift where they moved from much more federal and state funding for universities to like a lot of private donors. And once that happened, then you are essentially beholden, or at least you tell yourself this story that you're beholden to the political leanings of the private donors. You began to see this huge crackdown on academic freedom and public speech and protest in the university space. I've been at Stockton for the last 11 years full time, but 15 years total. What I can tell you about Stockton in terms of like this idea that it's this radical space, you can't even hang a poster on the wall without hearing about it from your dean. I tell you this from personal experience many, many times, because when I teach composition in the fall, I typically have my students do a rhetorical analysis, or we study rhetoric because it's a composition class. And so frequently I'll have them do some kind of rhetorical message that they have to then choose an appropriate place to hang on campus. And I won't let them get permission because that's like part of the project. And without fail, and these are very mild things, right? These are like, stop campus sexual harassment, or we need more space in the women's center, like extremely mild political positions. And every single time somebody complains because they don't have permission to hang the poster in that space. This is to say nothing of like trying to have a real protest. I mean, we had a little teach-in a month ago on campus. As soon as the word got out that we were going to be doing it, the cops were there. And there was the special team of staff members that are there just in case something goes wrong. And there's so much policing of public speech all the time on campuses. So it's just absurd to think that most campuses are these radical spaces. They're not. That said, that should give people who are unfamiliar with these spaces a much better insight into why they reacted the way that they did when there were these encampments.
Thanks for that background. You spoke some about examples both of craven capitulation, Columbia, and some resistance, Harvard. That's the only example I have, but I want to know from you, maybe there's others. You wrote in the piece, institutional silence, to say nothing of institutional complicity, has long been the course. And I'm wondering, are there examples that people should know, professors that we should be supporting, universities that we should be supporting and amplify? Like, are there seeds of resistance that you're seeing, or maybe not?
Yeah, there are definitely. I mean, if you want like a list of faculty to support, yeah, it's a long list, right? But there are faculty that you would think like, come on, get out there, and they're not. Some of these people are older, and I don't know, maybe their radical days are over. I keep waiting for that to.
Are there campuses that are smaller that have done anything defiant in a way that Harvard has, but because they're not so high profile, it doesn't get noticed in the same way?
I have not seen any really loud examples of that yet. I hope that there will be more soon. I mean, one thing I can say is there's this really important, and I hope this serves as a model for other places, the members of the Big Ten. I think it's University of Michigan, Rutgers. I mean, the Big Ten is like sports. And so the members of the Big Ten, not like their sporting side, but the faculty senate of each of those places got together and they formed what they're calling an academic compact. The faculty senate passed these resolutions. So Rutgers, which is the state university of New Jersey, we have their resolution as a model that we've been looking at Stockton, that basically like if you attack one of us, you attack all of us. And so they are collectively resisting the attacks on academic freedom and also funding by the Trump administration. At Stockton, we have not yet done that. We have one wonderful faculty member who has drafted a resolution and who is trying very hard to push our faculty senate to adopt it. So far, there has been some resistance to that, which I find really disappointing. I don't really watch cable news or anything, but a friend sent me a clip of Rachel Maddow talking about the Big Ten academic compact. And she said, I just have 2 words of advice to other universities that are watching this and thinking about doing it. Go faster. And I was like, yes, exactly. Right. Like you have to really move quickly, because that's the other thing about fascism. They don't wait around. They don't wait around, and they're not very smart. They're not like sitting here like strategically thinking like, how can we do this in this really strategic way so that everybody will fall for it and then we have ultimate power. They bulldoze over people, right? Like that's the whole idea. And so you have to be prepared for the bulldozer. I have my little group that I work with at Stockton, and we're working really hard to try and push the faculty senate to at least meet and discuss adopting this. So far, though, there's been some resistance to that. But I would say that is the primary example that I've seen most recently that really heartened me, because they were like, no. If you come for one of us, you come for all of us, and then we're all going to fight back at you. But America's massive. There's so many colleges and universities. And the other terrifying thing, I think, if you know anything about history, universities tend to be the first places that they purge, because they want to get rid of the intelligentsia, because they don't want the people that have a platform and have the historical and political knowledge and the finesse to convey that knowledge. They don't want them telling on them. So as soon as they started really coming for the universities, I was like, this is really happening. Like,
absolutely.
we have to fight back.
We talked about it, I guess, earlier in the conversation, but the people who are like, I'm just trying to keep my head down and do my job. I don't want to ruffle any feathers. You know, I'm here to teach, so I'm going to teach. I'm here to research. I'm going to research. One of the most powerful sections to me in the letter was where you and others wrote, but there is no appeasing an openly fascist Trump administration, for we know that no one is safe under fascism. When we keep our heads down and stay the course, the fascists continue to lie, extort like the mobsters they are, and humiliate and attack whoever they add to their list of enemies. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this and why it applies to so many beyond the universities, but why in particular for academics, you know, there is no just putting your head down.
Well, I think when you become an educator, particularly when you become a public educator, you take on a social responsibility. Your job is to educate the general populace. Your job is often, like at Stockton, our job is often to educate first generation college students, kids who come from really difficult, often traumatized backgrounds, who nonetheless are sitting in your classroom, like they're sitting in front of you, and they have every right to the same elite education that I got as someone who didn't grow up like that, who got to sort of pick and choose where she wanted to go and saw college as this like fancy adventure. And for me, and I know for a lot of my colleagues, well before the first Trump administration, I saw what I did oriented towards social justice. I believe that public resistance is part and parcel of that you should be a model to your students and to the people in your community of ways to resist this. And also, this is speaking very specifically to Stockton and very specifically to the way that I grew up. But I'm from Ventnor, New Jersey, which is a small shore town.
It's where I went as a child.
No.
It is. I live in Philly, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah. My Bubby and Zeta had a condo in Ventnor that as a child, that's where I went.
You've just made my day, Sam Goldman, because nobody knows anything about Ventnor City, New Jersey. That is fantastic. Oh my gosh. Well, I hope I get to meet you in real life, because I'm still here. I still live in Ventnor.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So then you get it. So I grew up in Ventnor City, New Jersey. South Jersey, which is where Ventnor is, it's just south of Atlantic City. It's like one town over from Atlantic City, unbeknownst to many people, but it was actually a place where many refugees from the Holocaust came after the Holocaust. First, they came to Millville, which is about an hour southwest of here. They were chicken farmers. And then not all of them, but many of them made their way toward the island, because Ventnor is on a barrier island called Ebsecan Island, which is also where Atlantic City is. I grew up with many, many, many people whose grandparents and aunts and uncles were survivors of the Holocaust and who had lost many relatives in the Holocaust. So many of my best friends were descended from Ashkenazi Jewish people who had survived the Holocaust, and oftentimes their grandparents lived with them or were often visiting. They had the tattoos on their arms. My one friend, Sherry, her grandmother had a heavy Polish accent and did not know how old she was because her parents had died at Auschwitz and she had been there when she was a small child. They had lost all their documentation. She didn't have a birth certificate. She was probably in her 80s, but really she didn't know. This had a tremendous effect on me growing up. So Stockton is nearby. It's about 25 minutes away. Stockton has a renowned Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, the first master's program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the United States of America. We have the Sam and Sarah Schofer Holocaust Resource Center, which has this incredible repository of memoirs and oral histories from Holocaust survivors in South Jersey and also farther afield. That was the landscape of my childhood, the imaginative landscape of my childhood in many ways. And I came of age hearing those stories and talking to those people and being taught that when this happens, you have to resist. You have to speak up. You have to fight back, that your whiteness won't protect you, that it may look like it's going to protect you, that your middle class values and station won't protect you. And you may have that delusion briefly, but in the end, they will come for you. I took that seriously. Those people, they were just incredibly important to me in ways that I can't even, as you can hear, I'm stumbling over the words. I can't articulate what it meant to me to know them growing up, to feel like I had a window into that history. Like I actually knew people that had been in those camps. It was extraordinary. It's just incredible to me that we could have that program at Stockton and that this could be happening and that people would just be saying nothing.
Really, really heavy. What does collective resistance look like to you in this moment? What do you hope to see from faculty, students, and beyond that you think would make a difference in stopping this fascist regime?
First, let me just say, just on a personal level, collective resistance looks like two things: showing up, even when you're tired. I keep hearing, because the people are like, oh, rest is revolutionary. Okay, sure, whatever, maybe, but not at the moment. It's really not, okay? So every time that I send out that group text and I'm like, there's a protest in O'Donnell Park at 2:00, let's go. I'm like, man, when people don't show up, now is the time. We have to be out in numbers. And that's where you meet your people. That's how you build community. As Audre Lorde said, there is no liberation without community. Like collective liberation is about having your community of people, having mutual aid. That's the first thing. And the second thing is those people are not always going to be your best friends. And that's okay. The amount of times in the last 4 months that someone in our little Stockton group has said something that's irked me, or I've talked over someone and they've been irked. And it's like at any given point, any one of us or all of us could have just been like, I can't do this. And there was one brief moment where I was like, I'm leaving the group chat. And then I was like, this is asinine. I'm going to leave the group chat because someone said something I disagreed with. Give me a break. You got to get over whatever those little bitchy moments are, because those people are your comrades and they are who you're going to be working with. And that is, until we begin to do that on a mass scale, it's going to fail, because I just think that's been a really valuable lesson for me, where there was one particular person who they kind of drove me a little crazy. And then I realized at a certain moment, I was like, it doesn't matter. That person would probably jump in front of a car for me, and I would do the same for them. This is a person that's willing to put their self on the line. I'm so grateful for that. So that's my 2 hot tips about that. And then in terms of national movements, there are already internal bodies in universities. Specifically, I'm thinking of faculty senates that I hope will really begin to band together and really speak out, because we had such a lukewarm reception from our Senate when we've tried to push statements, and because we started small, we didn't immediately say okay, let's publish a national letter. We tried to get buy-in from our institution and we really couldn't. And so one of the responses from one of the Senate exec members was well, we're all in this together. And I was like, no, we're not, because if you are not actively resisting, then we're not in this together, because you're not putting yourself at risk in the same way that all of us are. I really hope that those institutional mechanisms can begin to reach out across institutions and band together in the way I described earlier. But if they don't, then we have to see just other groups form, I think, and begin to work together, right? I'm sure at every campus in this country, there's some group like the group that I'm working with. There has to be. And you probably knew who they were before all this happened. There's always the rabble rousers. I really want to meet the other rabble rousers, and not just on campuses, like in my community. I mean, like I was at a protest on Saturday. I took my kids, and somebody who runs El Pueblo Unido, which is like a local immigrant rights group in Atlantic City, came up to me, and I was like, give me your number. And we exchanged numbers, and I was like, I'll knock on doors. I'll do whatever you need. I think because we live in this end stage capitalist dystopian nightmare, we think that the only way you can help people is to throw money at problems. But that's never been true. We need each other.
Absolutely. And I really appreciated two of the points that you made regarding collective action that I think are undervalued. And they're very similar, but they're versions of the way that we do this is in the streets with each other, that it's not mutual aid over here as a separate self-contained project, but the mutual aid is aiding the struggle in the streets. It's aiding the people who are going out and resisting day after day until the regime is gone. It's in conjunction with that. It's not community over here on the side as some like separate potluck system.
No.
Community is built in the streets and you find each other there and it's joyous there. It's liberatory there. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't extend outside of those times in the streets and that what you do in communities with others outside of work in the streets doesn't contribute back and it doesn't have value. It's in the service of more mass resistance, and that in that mass resistance, we're finding each other and we're supporting each other. And I just think that that's very undervalued right now.
So undervalued.
I know that like I sound like an old lady and I'm like the young people today, but it is a problem that these things are getting so separated from the struggle that's needed.
It's a huge problem.
And people are making themselves so much smaller than they should be.
And Sam, I'm sure you have to go, but this is such a joy to talk about this with you because, you know, when I took my 14-year-old son to this last protest and we were like chanting and he looked at me and he said, this is fun. And I was like, yes. And he left his phone in the car. I was so thrilled that he left his phone in the car.
Is this the 14-year-old? Whoa!
Yeah. And we were like, you know, there was really old people there and really young people there. And we were standing around the monument in Atlantic City, which is right across the street from Stockton's campus. There's something beautiful about yelling. You're yelling like, this is what democracy looks like over and over again. It's so liberatory, as you said. I was guilty in the first Trump regime, particularly of doing a lot of like online activism, right? I had much smaller kids then and I was on the tenure track. Like my life looked very different, but also like I made a commitment to myself. I was like, oh no, hell no. Because look at what happened between 2016 and 2020. You had all this group of really intelligent, vocal, thinking people, and I count myself amongst them, right? Who were like pouring all of our political energy onto this screen on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever. I'll never call it X. It's such a dirty trick because you're like, oh, I'm doing something. You feel like you're doing something. And not only are you really not doing anything, but also now you've just like handed all of your data over to these psychopath oligarchs who are now literally like stealing everything from the country and who were the whole time, right? But like for whatever reason, we were just going along with it. And then with these young people today, I know I feel really old too, but I teach them, so I see it. It's so hard for them to be in community. I mean, they were walloped by COVID and by taking basically 2 full years outside of the normative social educational experience, but also they were being told all the time to just stare at their phones. I mean, I have students who literally will tell me, oh, I can't be in line for coffee without my phone. I feel so weird. I feel so awkward. It becomes this security blanket and it takes them out of community. What used to happen when we would go into school, you'd go into class, you'd talk to people around you until the professor got there. That's how you made your friends. I'm telling you, Sam, I walk in the room, they all just are staring silently at their screen. So yes, get in the street, children.
It's good for humanity in the future, but also your like cognitive development. I'm concerned about what's happening.
Yes, and yes.
I want to thank you, Emily, for taking the time to share your perspective, your expertise, your insights, and this letter with the world. And for people that want to connect with more of your work, of your writing, where can we direct them? You have a new project in development, right?
I do. First of all, thank you so much for having me on. I was really nervous because normally I go on podcasts to talk about Sylvia Plath and stuff that happened between the years 1953 and 1975. But it was such a joy. You're a wonderful host and such great questions. So thank you so much. And for all the work that you're doing with Refuse Fascism, which we need more than ever. You can find me on Substack at lovingsylviaplath.substack.com, which is also the name of my book. That's Loving Sylvia Plath, a Reclamation. That came out with W.W. Norton and Company last summer, and it comes out this August in paperback, so that's exciting. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter at Emily Van Dyne. You can find a ton of my written work online too, mostly if you're interested in Sylvia Plath. I have a lot of work on her at lidhub.com. And I am presently working on a book called Unreliable, A History of Sex Education and Violence. And it's a book that's partly a memoir about what I described before, the terrible experience I had with Stockton and the lawsuits about their mishandling of sexual violence there. But it's also a history of Title IX and the ways that it has been exploited to do harm to outspoken faculty members. So it's also about those things.
Thanks so much. We'll definitely link those ways to connect with you in the show notes.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful.
Next, you'll hear my interview with Heather Squire. This is Heather Squire. Heather last week gave up the remaining 4 years of her PhD fellowship at the University of Buffalo's Department of Environment and Sustainability in opposition to the university's complicity amid national arrest and planned deportation of international students. In her statement when she resigned, she wrote, "I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of Environment and Sustainability. At the end of this semester, I will end my engagement with the university at Buffalo and forfeit the remaining 4 years of my fellowship in protest of this university's ongoing normalization of genocide and passivity in the face of surging fascism." Welcome, Heather. So glad to be talking to you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start off by really just expressing deep appreciation for the sacrifice that you're taking and the fact that you're doing so publicly and really sounding the alarm with your action. It's something that we need much more of, and I'm sure it wasn't easy, and it's really, really precious. So I know that you know that on many levels, I'm sure, but I just want to make sure that you're hearing that from other people too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I also have a background of being like a union organizer and a community organizer in the past in various social movements. So I tend to think of things in terms of power and strategy. One part of it is my very deep feelings of betrayal in a certain respect for being in this institution that's saying nothing and then choosing to change its policies to make student protest and connection even more difficult in the face of that. But it was also a decision of like, how can I make my little resignation at this state university on the other end of New York, not New York City, not Columbia University, but how can I make the biggest impact possible? The impact I really wanted to have was for my students that I TA'd for and had a closer relationship last semester to show that there are people willing to stand up, and just an example of what that could look like. For me, there's been students that have been standing up in really significant ways all along. There's been like a little bit of a student movement at the university at Buffalo around Palestine. There's a variety of reasons why it hasn't been super powerful, but I think that plays out on a lot of different campuses. And yeah, I wanted to kind of break open the feeling of this enclosure as there's no alternative. Everything's been decided. You can't do any kind of protest that mildly inconveniences anybody. You can't say anything about any state that has a state-specific religion. We're an institution of academic freedom and all of this stuff. These policies that are just stifling. I'm an older student. I hope that by coming back to finish my PhD, I really wanted to work on in sustainability of what are some tools for our movements? What can I bring to it so we can be more powerful, focusing on climate change and other environmental issues? And imperialism and the struggle for free Palestine is part of that.
Thanks for linking that up. We mentioned just a moment ago that you're a second-year doctoral student in the Department of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Buffalo. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of pull back the lens a little bit more and talk about what made you to decide to not only leave the program, but also do so publicly, posting an open letter to the university on your Instagram.
I'd say that around March 18th, when not that anybody thought the ceasefire held a lot of weight, but it was around March 18th, I believe, that the airstrikes, the really intensive airstrikes, it just started all over again. It was the trauma on top of the trauma of you calm down for a few minutes because there's just not quite as many people being murdered every day. And at the same time, I don't know the exact days, but it all happened within a couple of days that Mahmoud Khalil was abducted from New York and sent to the prison. And then it was sort of over those next couple of days, there were even more students, scholars that were abducted. I've never personally had any relationship or conversation with those students. But I know that all of us are vulnerable. Disappearing people is what you're used to hearing about, in South America, places where our CIA has helped stage a coup and there's a dictator in power. And that's how they got rid of a lot of political enemies. And we're not used to hearing that in the United States. So it's very easy for normalization to happen where it's like, well, they had to get in trouble. They must have done something. Like there's all of this rationalization happens so quickly. That was the red line for me, was those things simultaneously happening in Palestine and then in the United States. And so I talked to some people for a little bit of advice and then kept it for myself. And I was like, this will be most effective. There's not really a movement here. So what can I do with this? The statement was actually the last thing I wrote. I decided the date, and then I reached out to some other more active student groups online to try and get a little bit of solidarity for it. And then I had TA'd for this environmental justice class last semester. So it was like a class of 75 students, and then I got to lead the recitation for each of those 3 sections. It was so fantastic. And I always mention the students were quieter in class, but through their writing, they were writing reflection essays throughout the semester. I saw they cared so much. And that they were kind of like strangers to each other. Like a couple people knew each other, but there were people with all these ideas. They're facing the environmental collapse as well as this genocide. What does it say to them that we're doing nothing? And the professors and the people they're looking up to are saying well, you just keep your head down, get your degree, make money. That's the most important thing. So I wanted to give them one final lesson in a way of what? Sometimes you have to get messy and you can't predict everything that's going to happen from it. But sometimes you just have to, throw yourself on the gears of the machine in order to do it. So I made sure that I emailed that statement to all of my students and I CC'd them so that they would have access to that because, each other's email addresses so that they could contact each other. And I got an email from a couple that they have started doing that. So that was a strategic decision. And I was like, all right, cool. Because, when you're union organizing, trying to get list of all the workers that you're trying to organize is always a struggle. And sometimes you have to go to court to get it. So I was like, all right, if I just kick this off and that they can reach each other, that'll help them out to organize further. Because I want to give them tools. That's kind of how I've always seen myself as an educator, whether it's at the university or as a union organizer doing workshops to train shop stewards. Is here's some tools. Let's practice interacting with them together. And you're going to take these tools and it's going to be how you express your resistance and your solidarity. And they evolve from there and it's yours.
Can you tell us more about what the university was doing / not doing that you were pinpointing as complicity, if not collaboration, in terms of the genocide and the ascension of fascism?
The complicity part is bigger, and the timeline for that is a lot bigger than October 7th. Students that have been advocating for Palestine have been targeted since the 1960s. There's a whole lot of infrastructure that kind of captures a lot of parts of universities, which it's not like, oh, this conspiracy. It's not like that. It's that within these institutions, there are ways that certain types of things can become embedded in them and people with more power are able to weave them in. So, it already existed on October 7th, 2023. There was already the context that these are things that don't get talked about. There's already the context where the American Studies Association is being sued because they're participating in boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The University of Buffalo in particular, like many other public universities and private ones, have ongoing relationships with weapons manufacturers. The biggest weapons manufacturer in the Buffalo, Western New York area is Moog. They're doing all of the technical stuff to make sure the missiles are guided. There's so much of that industry in this country that money flows through the universities. And so there's that relationship. There's the investments. I started a year ago, and the first class, a leadership and sustainability class, taught by a tenured professor and a scholar of war and the environment. I walked into that class the first day a year ago. The introduction to the class was the professor telling us about how, I don't want to say ranting because I don't want to pathologize like a woman who has talking is trying, but she was like going on and on about how Hamas was raping women, and that it was after the New York Times propaganda. It was, you like watched all these things happen, and you're stuck in this place where nobody in the class says anything, but the academic freedom is understood that you could say that. You don't have to have any empirical evidence to present that, because that is the dominant narrative. And you can just say that and not get in trouble. If you were to come in and say the opposite, which isn't even equivalent with what the Palestinian resistance is saying, like if you were to come in to the opposite and have some crazy lie about or super exaggeration or unproved thing on the first day of class as a professor, you would definitely get reported by a student. I had a student who threatened to report me to the dean because she saw me wearing a ceasefire shirt on a day I wasn't even teaching. Those things existed before October 7th happened. In my department in particular, there was that, but it's also, nobody's saying anything about the environmental impact of carpet bombing Gaza over and over again. It's just sort of like optional. And as I started digging into that, I did some research, and then you recognize, oh my God, the US military is the biggest institutional consumer of petroleum and producer of carbon. And you're like, oh, across 950 foreign military bases, they use so much petroleum that they actually determine a lot of geopolitical strategy. Oh, you're like, oh. And in academia, everybody's a liberal, unless you're a hardcore conservative in the economics department for the most part. Everybody's a liberal. And there's just so much disavowal of imperialism. You just don't touch it. And so it doesn't ever exist in their worldview. It's like evasion. They're like, this is my very narrow thing. I don't have to think about that. And that to me was so jarring, because it's like, all right, we are within the United States, even without the military, we are the biggest consumers and producers of carbon emissions, the biggest consumers of everything, all of this stuff at 4% of the global population. There should be some accountability. And then you tack on the military thing, nothing. It's stunning that it's so easy to have a liberal narrative of human rights and stuff like that. That's also quietly saying we are going to continue to dominate economically and militarily the rest of the world to protect our lifestyle. There's nothing you can say to change that, and we're not going to change that, and we're not going to challenge it. It was very frustrating to me, and I started doing research on my own, did a project about the impact of military, and not even just the United States, but in general, the impact of militarism on the environment. And I was like, this is so big. This isn't like, oh, I found this little pet variable that adds 0.3% to global emissions. It was just this huge thing, and nobody is even mentioning it at all. And it made me feel like the research isn't even real. Like we're existing in this abstract place where there's this and then there's that, but there's no cohesion to a worldview and how we try to find solutions or look at what the root causes of the problems are. It's sort of like you could just get a PhD and say whatever the heck you want is the big problem. It just doesn't matter. And that for me made me feel like I was going crazy. And then also there was an attempt at an encampment at the University of Buffalo at the end of the spring 2024 semester. It was met by police. A few students were arrested. They were pretty brutal. And then by the end of the summer, the administration quietly changed the policy to protest to make it super narrow. You're not allowed in the buildings. You're not allowed to disturb anybody. You're not allowed to put any flyers up anywhere on campus besides the very specific bulletin boards. And the language that you're not allowed to be critical. The way it was tiptoeing around this tight wire, this walking around, and it felt like these games that ultimately took the voice away from students. And it's very easy to be like, yeah, but you don't want to trash university, and everybody deserves to come to the university and not be bothered. That laid the groundwork for students to have no voice right now after the Trump election, and now that there's all of this crackdown. The university didn't say like, okay, you know what? We're going to make this whole campus a more intensive free speech zone. We're going to guarantee the rights of our professors and encourage them to speak out. There's so many ways they could have brought people together. They could have done a lot of public education around things like race science, which is supposed to be like settled science, that eugenics is bad and wrong. It's not settled because there's policies. And you'd think that these very intelligent people who run the university and make a lot of money, a lot more than I do, would at least have an assistant that would read these tea leaves even before Trump got elected and said, okay, how can we meet this moment? We know these things are going to come. We've read Project 2025, which has existed for a while, and we're going to have a plan. Instead, it's kind of like, well, we're just going to let the lawyers deal with it. I don't know. And I'm like, you're supposed to know, at least have a plan. You don't have to be free of failure. Things don't have to be completely successful, but you could have come with a plan. In the first week of the semester, at like 8 o'clock on a Friday night, the president of the university sent an email to everybody. We hear you that the international students and some people whose families are vulnerable to deportation are feeling upset. We recommend you go talk to counselors. There was nothing like, we can assure you we've got your back. There was just nothing. And so that's that quiet compliance. Because these moves they've made have been so evasive, you can't point to one thing and be like, oh, they're just quietly complying. It's a protection for them as they choose the path of silence.
Thanks for that breakdown. Since you wrote the letter, the Trump regime has issued a series of demands to Harvard that were a bridge too far for them. And the administration at Harvard has announced that they will refuse compliance with the government's attempts to oversee curriculum and hiring decisions. Academics around the country are breathing a sigh of relief that someone somewhere is taking a stand. And I wanted your thoughts on what you think it represents that Harvard is doing this, and what does that mean for smaller universities, all without the 50B endowment?
They're like the oldest university, the most prestigious university in the United States and in the world. Everybody knows that brand of Harvard. So I think it's great that they stood up, even if it took them this long and they had to be pushed, but at least they had a red line. And I appreciate that. That was one of the questions that I asked in my letter to the professors, the academics. Do you have a red line? You need to know if you have a red line, because things are moving quickly. They're not going to be as they are today, where you're flippant and hopeful. Things keep moving. So that's good. But I do feel like because of how passive academia in general has been, and I'm not talking about the students who have protested and stuff like that, but like professors, the administration, and even a lot of grad students.
The institutions themselves, yeah.
For instance, I hope SUNY takes the State University of New York system, that University of Buffalo's part of. I hope they take some courage from that and say like, all right, we can push back too, but maybe they don't have that endowment that would enable them to keep functioning. That's a factor. But I think, I don't know, for academics to breathe a sigh of relief, I like lurk on the like different academic subreddits and hear the conversations. And there's passivity. There's just passivity in this fear, this paralysis, in the same way that like MAGA people are like, oh, come on, I just need the powerful Trump is just going to make things okay. It's like they're seeking the same thing. They're seeking from the top permission to resist and just a signal that, don't worry, the professionals are taking care of it. And in that, they're evading their own responsibility for like leading the movement, for organizing now when it's easier, because it's not going to get easier to organize.
I think what you just said about like, it's not going to get easier. I really hope people get that very soon. It's going to be harder, so much harder than it already is. People talk about risk and sacrifice and like, you're somebody who made a concrete sacrifice, like you've already done it. And there's so many people, I feel like right now, who are still trying to figure out how we do this without putting any skin in the game. And it worries me so deeply because of what that means about the trajectory we're on and the suffering that we can't describe at this point that they have in their minds as their game plan. If this is what they're already doing, not 100 days in, what is their plan? And if we're not gonna act now, there's not some later time where we get to do it risk-free. And I wanted to, as we end our conversation, go there about fear, because you've written about it, you've been thinking about it, you've been talking to people about it, and working with your own fear to act and not be immobilized. And resisting fascism is of necessity, as we talked about throughout the conversation, going to involve sacrifice. You've sacrificed an academic fellowship and potentially a career path also. And I'm wondering, what do you have to say to others who are considering how they can best impact this terrible situation right now, especially young people, students?
Practice little acts of disobedience is one thing. Not jaywalk all the time, but for instance, you can put stickers and hang flyers. You can do lots of little agitational things like that, and you're not very likely to get caught, and they're not likely to have a very high consequence. But once you practice that, you realize the arbitrary nature of all of these rules that you're caught in, and it makes you more comfortable with it. Another thing I think is, in specifically thinking about fear, is to remember that fear is a feeling. We might say, I am scared because of the English language, but it's really a feeling that you have. And it's giving you information about reality mixed with the past, mixed with these things. You're gonna have to just sit with it and think about it and wait for it to pass and accept that that feeling will pass and that there's going to be real uncomfortable uncertainty and that that's okay. Especially any listeners that have had to go through the work of trying to heal childhood trauma or something like a narcissistic abusive relationship. You have to do a lot of work to recognize the physical sensations of fear in your body to become comfortable enough to be all right, this isn't going to kill me. It feels like it. It feels horrible. I hate this. But it's not killing me. When you find those people that are near you, start having conversations, very honest conversations with each other about where do you have power? Where are you adjacent to power? What are you scared of? We have to be vulnerable enough to each other to say that. I've become so close to a couple of friends over the last 18 months of the genocide because we've been so vulnerable to each other, and we've lost friends, we've lost relationships because of our advocacy around Palestine. And in that connection, we've been so vulnerable, and we've approached each other on times when we're crying or so on edge and hopeless. And just in that relationship, to be so honest, it helps you go forward, and it also helps you unburden, and you're doing it reciprocally. So you're not taking advantage or taking for granted, that you're really trying to do it in this mutual way, so that you're co-regulating, processing emotions, and also thinking strategically about, you're all right, so I have this little bit of power. Oh, I know this one thing. What are some creative ways? That's one more thing. It's you can be creative. This can be an expression of your creativity. We're so taught, I think, now that creativity is a role. It's a commodifiable skill type of thing. And that's all that it is. But it's inherent in all of us. That's life. That's love. It's all generative. And there's so many different ways to express that through art and through writing. And, you can make videos. I've made block printed postcards and sent them in the mail and put a QR code on them, connecting it to my website. People might think that's silly, but it made me happy and it felt good to do it. And I processed a lot of the fear and emotions. You know what I mean? Carving these blocks, doing it over and over again, this kind of repetition that you learn being a line cook. You're I've got to make 500 dumplings. Okay. Just doing that, it just changes you. Taking action changes you. You're not the same person you were the day before. Your fear becomes less. You become kind of excited by the fact of your own agency. That gives you energy to go forward. I guess so. I have lots of idea about nurturing and fertilizing more so than specific things, because it's going to look different for everybody.
I want to thank you so much, Heather, for taking the time to talk with us, to share your experience, your insights, your perspectives, and how can we connect with your work, your writing, all your stuff? Where should we direct people to?
My website is very long, but I don't care. I like it. It's called permanentlyembarrassedbillionaires.com. It's just my blog and where I keep my different projects that I work on and invite other people to collaborate with me, ideally. And then also on Instagram, that's pretty much the only social media I do. It's at Hard Bones Heather. Hard Bones is this memoir that I wrote during the pandemic about healing trauma, trying to figure it out, martial arts, my brother's death. It's about a lot of stuff. So I think it's about trying for me to deal with my own alienation. That's there. That's for free too. You could buy a copy or else read it right on my website if that's something that you're interested in.
Thank you so much, Heather.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Bring the demand Trump must go now into May Day actions. Find resources at refusefascism.org and save the date for May 17th, a national day of protest to declare the Trump fascist regime must go now. Stay tuned to refusefascism.org and our social media at Refuse Fascism. Want to support the show? Spread the imperative and support the show by getting merch, see the show notes, or by joining our Patreon community to fuel refusal of this fascist nightmare. Sign up at patreon.com/refusefascism or make a one-time donation in support of the show at refusefascism.org by hitting the donate button or via Venmo at refuse-fascism. Or for $0, share the show with others, rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our socials or YouTube. It makes a difference and is so appreciated. Of course, we want to connect with you on social media at Refuse Fascism, including on Blue Sky, and you can find us on TikTok at Refuse Fascism, with fascism being spelled wrong, FASHISM, to get around TikTok's stupid rules. As always, thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkleman for helping produce this episode. Be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get updates from us every week in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.